see how an important decision by an international tribunal helps guide, helps shape, helps support a completely new kind of opinion in Japan. And I am pretty sure if we go to Japan today, no one supports killing whales except a very, very small group of people who, there are some communities over the years, they have engaged in killing whales. And we can understand it was part of those communities. But overall, if you look at Japan as one entire country, public opinion surveys show there is no support for killing whales. This, I think, helps us see that we are studying not just law, but how citizenship and the public and public opinion changes in support of the environment. What if we took today the most difficult question of all? Before we focus on the story of trade, let's discuss climate change. Is there any bigger issue in the world than climate change? No. Is there any bigger part of global citizenship than climate change? No. We are all part of this discussion. If we live in the western part of China, if we live in the northern part of California, if we live in Hawaii, which is where I have just come from, it's the same discussion in 200 countries. Climate change. For the next few minutes, let's go more deeply into this. And after we understand climate change better, we'll start to focus more on the story of trade and how trade relates to everything we've discussed. We go back to 1900. In 1900, you have this brilliant scientist in Sweden, Arrhenius. Arrhenius is so brilliant that he actually works in 3 or 4 or 5 fields of science. I think he wrote his first book when he was 15 years old, maybe 16 years old. And by the time he's 21, 22, or 23, Arrhenius is probably the most brilliant scientist in Europe. In 1900, he's working on his experiments on climate change. And in 1902, he comes to the United States. And Arrhenius is a lecturer at the University of California at Berkeley. So in 1902, we have important research from Sweden and the United States on climate change. Unfortunately, between 1902 and 1950, there are 2 great big world wars, and modern society really doesn't study climate change over all those years as it should have. Finally, in 1959, the United States establishes the first scientific study and creates a new program in Hawaii, the first program in the world to seriously collect data and scientific studies on climate change. In the 1960s, there are more studies, and by the end of the 1960s, we began to grasp more about climate change. And finally, in 1972, does everyone remember in 1972 that great big conference in Sweden, the Stockholm Conference? At that conference in 1972, climate change is actually discussed. So we could say the modern discussion of climate change begins in 1972. And after that, we come to 1992. And in 1992, we have the first international agreement on climate change. And you have 150 countries agreeing on a structure to understand climate change. And those countries in 1992 include India, include the US, and include China. Now, why are we discussing those three countries? Those three countries together contribute emissions to the climate. The US, of course, had been doing it for many, many, many years. So the US is the single biggest contributor of emissions. But over the last 20, 30 years, India became a bigger and bigger contributor. And over time, with the remarkable growth and the economic powerhouse that China has become, its emissions have also gone up. What's great is all three countries agree on the 1992 structure to address climate change. Unfortunately, since 1992, there are many more conferences, there are more agreements, there are more meetings, there are more studies, and there are many efforts by many countries. But in reality, by 2000, 2001, 2002, there really is not that much progress on climate change. Progress really only gets moving again. Finally, the United States has a new president, President Obama, and China has a very, very thoughtful leader. And the president of the US and the leader of China meet and talk. And gradually, these two big powerhouse countries agree they will meet at the United Nations and they will announce they are in support of new ways to address climate change. Now, can everyone see how important it is when the US and China really began to cooperate? Other countries around the world begin to see, oh my gosh, this is really, really important. And what happens? India, which had been very, very difficult to deal with, India now realizes if China and the US are going to work together, we in India are going to have to work together. And out of all these discussions, finally, in 2015, 150 countries agreed to a new approach to climate change, a completely new approach. And India is there, China is there, and the US is there. Now, what is happening in Paris that is revolutionary? What is happening? You have 150 countries. That's brilliant. All these countries agree. But you have something else, something that we haven't talked about. And we're about to talk about that more. You have big, big, big companies, even oil companies, multinational corporations, BMW from Germany, Honda from Japan. These companies have come to the conference in Paris in 2015, and they are agreeing that we need new approaches to climate change. Why are these big companies doing that? Why are these big companies now supporting climate change? First, they're doing it because they're smart companies. They realize there's going to be more regulation. Second, they're doing it because it's in their own self-interest. If BMW doesn't build good cars, if Honda doesn't build good cars, nobody in California is going to buy their cars. And California is $1 billion market for nice cars. But the third reason that these big companies are supporting the Paris conference and the Paris Agreement, they're doing it because they realize the world is changing. Business must adapt to this new world. Business, in order to be successful, must understand climate change is going to be crucial for the future of the entire world. Now let's make that a little more specific. If you are someone who has a certain amount of money and you want to invest that money, we're now talking about the story of trade. You want to invest that money. Are you going to invest it